All right. Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar, officially launching the textbook, Chaplaincy and Spiritual Care in the 21st Century, a project that's been in the making since 2019. My name is Michael Skaggs. I'm Director of Programs at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. I'll just say a few words on behalf of the lab before we get started, and then I'll turn it over to our guests today. First, like most of our events, this is being recorded, and so if you have to leave early or you miss a point that you want to come back to, don't worry about that. You'll get a link to that recording as soon as it's available. When we send the recording out, there's a little bitty survey that'll be in there. It just tells us what you thought about your experience here. It helps us plan future events, so please take a minute or so to fill that out. And then finally, I do want to thank the University of North Carolina Press for offering a discount on all book orders. In just a minute, I'll put a link to the book to the press's website. You can order right there. There's a 40% discount. You can do that. And then I will also put in a link for a very, very simple drawing form. And so we'll say the first 15 people to fill that out, you get a credit for the book at audible.com. And that way you can listen to the book wherever you are, on the treadmill, walking around the neighborhood, doing the dishes, whatever you do, you can listen to it there. So don't rush off. I'll post that link here in a second, and then you can go fill that out. So with that, let me introduce our guests, all of whom were very closely involved with conceptualizing and or writing the book. Jason Callahan is a palliative care chaplain at Virginia Commonwealth University, a frequent collaborator with the lab. Welcome back, Jason. Pamela McCarroll, is a professor of theology at Emmanuel College in the University of Victoria of the University of Toronto. Pam, I still don't understand that system, but I know that's the correct way of putting it. And then finally, Shelly Rambo is a professor of theology at Boston University School of Theology and one of the lab's longest serving collaborators, one of the PIs on the project that gave rise to the book. I'm very grateful to have you all with us today. Welcome. And Shelly, I turn it to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And I'm just really pleased to be here with Pam and Jason. And I'm just envisioning all the other co-authors and people who didn't author but gave rise to this book. I thought instead of having an insider celebration where we say, yay, we published a book, that I would take about 10 minutes and give some context, some history about how the book came to be, to underscore some of the commitments that we have like running throughout the book, one of which is collaboration, another just networking, and third, I think commitments to pluralism, racial justice, diversity. So some of those things that are threaded throughout the whole book, I just want to highlight that. So I will share this PowerPoint. And I also, some of you may have expected to see Wendy Cadge here. Wendy was pulled into a meeting that she couldn't get away from. Are you seeing all the links here, or are you seeing my main screen?
We
Pam?
can see the full on screen there.
You can see everything. Let's see. How about that? Is that better?
Can you do the presenter mode? The presenter view, rather. It might clean things up a little bit.
Presenter view. All right. Having a little delay on technology. How's that?
What are we missing here?
No?
Well, you know what? We can see everything. So why don't we'll just continue from here. There's nothing extraneous. I think we're all right.
Okay. It's not perfect, but we're going to go with it. All right. A little bit of the history of the textbook. I don't know if it's not working. I can just talk without the PowerPoint. It's okay. I'm going to go. I'm going to forge ahead, folks. Part of the PowerPoint was just to give you a sense of that this was not just a creation of Wendy and myself, but a collaboration that started with an in-person gathering. We received a loose foundation grant that we titled Educating Effective Chaplains. You can see it's a multi-year grant from 2019 to we closed out at the end of last year. And the aim of that grant was really to explore how, from various sectors and sites of education, how we're preparing chaplains to do what they do. And what we know is that a lot of people are doing amazing educational work. But we also know that the stakeholders in education are often not talking to each other, right? There are silos in which all of us are doing really good work with it, whether we're in theological schools, whether we're in CPE sites, whether you're working chaplains or endorsers. All of these conversations are happening. And I think I can say in a very robust way. And there's a lot of changes that are going on within theological schools, I can say from my position, around a lot of excitement around chaplaincy education. But those conversations don't always happen with the other stakeholders. So we had some concerns coming into the Educating Effective Chaplains grant to say, can we bring people together who are stakeholders in chaplaincy education to think about how to better do what we do. You'll note that this also coincided with the launch of the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab. So you'll see how much the work of this grant in the textbook was coinciding with the launch of the Innovation Lab. So you'll often see multiple names and multiple endorsements and efforts going on at the same time. This quote is attributed to Joretta Marshall, who's an incredible pastoral theologian, who, when interviewed as part of, I think, a Templeton grant, was asked really, is there a bigger endeavor around chaplaincy education? Is there something that we can do together that can support chaplains and preparing chaplains for the future? So I attribute that to Joretta, and our aim really was to bring together stakeholders across various sectors, folks in military chaplaincy, community chaplaincy, healthcare, prisons, etc., bringing those folks together and thinking from different sites of education and training. This is my fancy map to really note some of the strength of the conversation. You'll note at the beginning of the textbook, there's two really robust chapters from social scientists and historians who are mapping the kind of, in very short amount of pages, mapping the history of chaplaincy and the mandates around chaplaincy that are really important to kind of know for especially chaplains going into, or from my angle, students who are interested in going into chaplaincy. What do they need to really know about the history of the field and profession they're going into?
Shelly, can I jump in very quickly?
Sure. Yeah.
We're still looking at your first slide.
Oh, okay. This isn't working.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Someone recommended hit play from start. Maybe that will do it.
Thanks. You can always interrupt me, Michael.
There we are.
If I'm talking about a very exciting slide that is not there. Okay.
You may just have to sort of like scroll through and click as you go.
Is that working?
We see the map now. We see the map,
Yes.
the sort of rough circle.
Okay. All right, you know what? I'm going to skip to the next slide and see, does that work? No. You know what? I'm just going to go, I'm going to stop the screen share and just talk. How's that?
What has now become Zoom old school.
I'm going Zoom old school. Okay. Yeah, I have
great.
slides here. I can just talk us through
Great.
and make the slides available later. All right. So what we had hoped to do is bring together social scientists and historians. That's reflected in the textbook. And to intentionally pair in the textbook chaplaincy educators and theological educators. So you'll see in how we organize, those folks are co-writing chapters together. So you get the kind of active chaplaincy workplace education with theological educators who are training people in degree programs at theological schools. A couple of things that we discussed and learned that I want to highlight in that big conversation. If I was showing you that room, you would see about 40 plus people who gathered in 2019, in the summer of 2019. Our hope was to gather every summer, but you'll notice that was not possible because of COVID. So we had an initial big person meeting, which was really effective in launching the collaborative network that gave rise to the textbook. We discussed really rising interest and investment in chaplaincy, the changing religious landscape in which chaplains are kind of moving and working. We discussed curriculum and programs. One thing that won't surprise you is that a lot of theological schools are offering programs in chaplaincy, but they look very different. So you could say this is the no standardization issue. And we really discussed the problems with standardizing curriculum and the limitations of not having standardized programs, right? So you could see the reflexive conversation around how do we train chaplains, what's necessary in a chaplaincy curriculum, what's happening in theological schools, and then what's happening in CPE, right? And often those aren't directly linked. So a lot of theological schools, with some exceptions, a lot of us outsource to CPE, but know very little about what's actually happening in those programs. We talked about the problem of silos and sectors. So the dominance of healthcare has really been the kind of standard conversation, but we also notice and are excited about emerging sectors of chaplaincy, community chaplaincy, social movement chaplaincy, areas of chaplaincy that our students are very interested in. So we're seeing a rise in interest in what are less dominant forms of chaplaincy ministry. We also discussed the problems of the pipelines for chaplains, especially from underrepresented groups. That's religious representation, and also the obstruction, the very white dominant institutions in which many chaplains are trained. And just simple things like are students of color encouraged to go into chaplaincy? And when they do, and if they do, are they well supported in the profession? So the concerns, I think, from educators about the diversity of religious diversity, but also representation and support for students of color. You'll notice that, I mean, in all publications that are current, COVID made an impact, and COVID really changed the ways in which we had discussions about our collaborative work. And we think it impacted the tenor or tone of the chapters. And we hope that comes through. Some of the concerns about how should we as a collective group be responding in this moment, thinking about where we're situated in terms of chaplaincy and spiritual care. The most striking element about the book, I think, is its structure. So those of you who are familiar with board certification and the competencies, the many competencies that are listed to be a board certified chaplain, you'll see 3 competencies in the book that structure the book. And this was our attempt to say all chaplains need to be competent in 3 general areas. And that allowed us naming 3 allowed us to speak across sectors, because some sectors a board certification isn't needed for their area of chaplaincy. So the 3 competencies are interpersonal competencies, organizational competencies, and Pam can speak best about the third, which is meaning-making competency. So those are the 3 that we think that all chaplains across sectors need to be competent and have capacities for addressing interpersonal dynamics, know something about organizations, be able to navigate power systems in organizations, and also address questions of meaning, purpose, and belonging that are at the core of many of our theological traditions, but are also broadly existential questions of meaning that translate into more pluralistic and public settings of care. The book, we hope you see collaboration throughout with the chapters co-written, social scientists, historians, etc., who are part of the conversation. If you were looking at my PowerPoint slide, you would see a kind of map of the different authors. The first section is really the background and context that provides in a very short survey of chaplaincy in the United States. Pam can talk a little bit about how she contributed to really expanding. It's not just the United States. Second chapter, really thinking about preparing across sectors. The mandates and preparation looks differently in different sectors. And often I know that my students are confused about what do I need to do if I'm going into this sector. So that chapter really kind of lays out things like endorsement, preparation, CPE requirements in the different sectors. Then we get into the 3 different competencies. Meaning making takes the lead, followed by interpersonal and organizational. And then Jason can talk more about this incredible conclusion, which is a little bit of the forecasting of the future of chaplaincy. I think just in close, I want to give thanks to UNC Press. I want to send a shout out to Kristen Redford Heidinger, who is our editorial assistant. Always thanks to Michael Skaggs, who supports this project in incredible ways. It's important for me to thank my dean, my former dean, Dr. Mary Elizabeth Moore, who also supported the gathering and the grant. All of the authors and Luce colleagues and the Henry Luce Foundation. We're just very grateful. I want to say that on a personal note, this project really started for me by asking for Wendy's feedback on strengthening the program in chaplaincy at VCU School of Theology. As somebody who teaches in the area of trauma and theology, I got a lot of chaplains coming through my class. And when I was aware of chaplains and more attentive, it led me to really think about what my school could do to strengthen the education of chaplains. And Wendy came in to kind of advise, which has led to an incredibly wonderful friendship and collegial collaboration that I've been honored to be a part of. It's a little bittersweet. We're publishing the book and also ending the grant. So we know that the work will continue. We're excited to hear how you'll use it in your classrooms and use it in your CPE sites. And with that, I'll turn it over to Pam.
Great, thanks so much, Shelly. Of course, right when I take off my mute is when a big truck goes by and honks outside. Anyway, the joys and troubles of Zoom. I also want to thank all of the folks that Shelly has thanked, as well as the Emmanuel College Center for Religion and its Context for co-sponsoring this today. and to Shelly and Wendy, especially, and Michael for bringing us all together. As Shelly says, it's been a really collaborative process, which of course, as those of us who work in collaborative processes know, that makes it take longer. There are lots of bumps and everything along the way, which is part of what makes it, gives it the energy and energizes the whole process. So I'm going to speak a little bit about, first of all, the meaning making section, which I co-edited with a colleague. Then I'm going to speak about a few features of the book that really stand out for me as an educator, both as a CPE supervisor educator and as a classroom educator in a theological school, a multi-religious theological school, Emmanuel College. And then I want to say a little bit about the Canadian context and how it connects with the Canadian context. So I've got a few notes here, so I'll be looking over a bit at them. So the meaning making section, which has 3 chapters in it and an introduction, I edited that with Dagmar Greff, who is CPE supervisor and director of spiritual care at Los Angeles Children's Hospital, and also herself a PhD in interreligious and multi-religious spiritual care. So it was a wonderful collaboration that way. And we talked through a lot. How do we describe this meaning-making competency? How do we present how it functions in spiritual care practice and education? In some sense, we make the argument that this meaning-making as a focus for spiritual care is the most distinctive element of the practice of spiritual care. And I think at some level, at least in the pluralistic and multi-religious, interreligious context, it's the least research. So I think that's interesting. And I think that's something we want to do more about. How we as humans, both individually and collectively, make meaning of our lives, not just cognitively and narratively, but relationally and interpsychically, spiritually, even biologically. These questions are central to experiences of suffering and flourishing, to practices of care, and to justice making. And we try to make these links in that chapter. As well, if we think about this sort of meaning making, we're drawing a lot on spiritual wisdom traditions. So throughout the millennia, spiritual wisdom traditions have developed cosmologies and narratives, sacred texts and practices that help to make meaning and to help people to survive and even thrive, especially in contexts of trauma and disruption. So there's so much richness to tap into there in terms of the meaning-making competency for contemporary spiritual care in connecting with the diverse spiritual and religious wisdom traditions. In many ways, my colleague Dagmar and I, as well as our other amazing authors in our section, who are Victor Gabriel and Dwayne Bidwell, and Bilal Ansari, and Rochelle Robbins, and Danielle Tumanio Hansen. Together, we all recognize that the work we've done in our chapters is kind of just the beginning of developing tools for teaching pluralistic approaches to meaning making in spiritual care and chaplaincy. So even as we see it as the beginning, we're also really excited about our contribution, and we really think it will help students and educators to build knowledge and skills in meaning making with individuals, with communities, and within institutions and society at large. So really looking forward to feedback and conversation around that. Some of the key features of the book I want to just point to. As a teacher in a multi-religious theological school, which we have CPE integrated into our curriculum, one of the things that's been so difficult is to find a text where I can teach sort of intro to spiritual care and counseling with one text instead of multiple chapters here and text here and bits here and bits here. So this really brings it all together. And I started to use some of the chapters last year when I was teaching my intro course, and it was great to have it all drawn together and all in one place. A lot easier for us who are teaching in the field to just have the one resource. The fact that so many of us are practitioners and educators coming together really shape the text. So it's really case-based. And those of you who are familiar with CPE training, for example, know how much case-based education is key. So starting from the kind of microcosm, looking at the micro levels, and then building that out and reflecting on it from larger perspectives. So there are case studies, there are verbatims that students can use that really invite experiential pedagogies in the classroom. Those have been so central to CPE training, and more are becoming central to, I would say, spiritual care and chaplaincy education within the theological schools too. There are questions and exercises at the end of each chapter. So these themselves are so useful because they actually, a lot of them could just take a long time, as the students are invited to role play or to have discussions around central themes, or to explore certain spiritual practices or utilize certain tools in their practice. Also a lot of self-reflective kind of activities throughout. So lots of richness there in terms of what the text offers for students and educators. And I think that's for both CPE units as well as in the classroom. And then I just want to say a little something about the relevance for the text outside the US context. As a Canadian myself, and I know there are a bunch of other Canadians on the attending today, how it would resonate in Canada as well as in other English-speaking countries outside the US. Recently, I've been doing a lot of research on spiritual care and chaplaincy in the Canadian context, and there are a lot of ways that there are parallels or intersections with the content of the text. The first two chapters are really, as Shelly mentioned, sort of introductory. And so there's one that's specifically on the US history of chaplaincy, but a lot of that overlaps or intersects very much with the Canadian context. So for example, you know, Anton Boysen and Richard Cabot, who started the CPE movement, for example, were teachers, supervisors for some Canadian pastors who went down to the States and were educated and brought CPE up to Canada. And so gradually that has evolved into what's now called the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. It's an organization which has reciprocity with ACPE in the US. And it serves as a regulator of CPE education in Canada, as a certifying body for practitioners, and as a professional association advocating on behalf of the discipline in Canada. So it's interesting because I found myself reading the history chapter and thinking, oh, the interconnections with Canada. And I think it might be interesting sometime, maybe in the second edition, if we have a kind of family tree here, because I think there would be all sorts of interesting visual ways of making the links. Also, chapter 2, Shelly mentioned, which talks about some of the different types of chaplaincies and some of the silos and the complexity and the different regulations. The research I've been doing in Canada has some very similar themes emerging. And even though we have a smaller population, so there are fewer silos and there's maybe a little bit more interconnection between the silos, there aren't as many organizations, which helps. And I think the recent emergence in Canada, like in the States, of many more chaplaincy education programs and spiritual care and psychotherapy and chaplaincy programs, I think that's helped to bring some of it together, actually to sort of identify some of a core curriculum that's happening in terms of the education for chaplains and spiritual care practitioners. The other thing that's interesting difference that is helpful in our context, that integrates a little bit more, is that CPE is very much embedded within the theological school curriculum. And so that's a nice kind of bridge there for sure. But most importantly, I want to just focus briefly on the three main competencies that are covered: meaning making, interpersonal, and organizational competencies. These offer a lot in terms of training in both the US and Canada, as well as I anticipate in the UK and Australia and New Zealand as well in particular. Across the chapters, all of them, as Shelly noted too, have a focus on intersectional justice and issues of power and privilege, racism, sexism, and how this all plays out in the therapeutic relationship or in the spiritual care relationship, as well as those larger systemic issues around assessment and how we think about justice and care together. So this is something that I know for our school, that's a priority, right? There aren't a lot of texts that bring those concerns together. And we desperately need that in our world today. And I think about CASC recently, the Canadian Association for Spiritual Care. A couple of years ago, we changed our competencies or updated them, I guess. And there's a number of competencies there around cultural humility. One in particular around learning about Indigenous persons' experiences of colonization, to understand the findings and recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation report. That kind of emphasis within the CAST competencies really connects very well with the concerns around racism and justice, and power and privilege and colonial kind of attitudes. So, and how that creates such extreme suffering and trauma, and how that plays out in terms of what we do in spiritual care. So, and a very strong emphasis also on advocacy as a part of the practice of spiritual care. A few of us in Canada were part of the team of authors, and throughout the text, there's regular mention of the Canadian context. I want to note in particular Thomas St. James O'Connor, Emeritus Professor at Martin Luther University College, a mentor to many of us in Canada, CASC educator and researcher. As well, I think we can claim Carrie Doring with her Canadian roots in education, and her work and her frequent presence among us in Canada has been important for the discipline in Canada. And I also want to say Shelly Rambo herself, I think we can adopt her as a Canadian since she has such close connections with us. But we look forward to your feedback on the book, to your engagement with it as a text, as we anticipate a second edition coming out sometime in the next few years. Thanks so much. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks a lot, Pam. I echo those statements completely. Thank you, Shelly. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Michael. Of course, a shout out to Wendy, and I especially want to give a thanks to Trace Haythorne, who also was supportive of me and co-authored the section and chapter that we wrote together. And well, what is that? It really is, okay, what is the future of chaplaincy? What does it look like? What are some of the things that we can do? But what do we ultimately hope for in this profession? And I think that this book is probably, to this point, the best opportunity to expose to the masses. And I'm not just saying people that are interested in going into spiritual caregiving, but also people who are just interested in being people and approaching justice, because chaplaincy can be a catalyst for a lot of people. I myself represent what I think is coming. As an atheist, as someone who grew up in a church setting, but didn't necessarily have the same belief systems, there's a void that's been created. And when many people leave their spiritual foundations, there's nowhere for them to go. However, what we know now, especially during the pandemic, is that there is a space for chaplaincy actually to take the place of something that didn't work for people in the past. I do believe that moving forward in the future, we're going to see a lot more chaplains in the field. We know that, and I speak as someone who is also a member of APC, Association of Professional Chaplains, that recently the degrees that have been accepted in order to get into CPE programs and become a professional board certified chaplain, we're opening up because it's acknowledging that it's no longer just the traditions of religions that came before, but psychologists, social workers, people who are interested in philosophy. So what we're going to see now is the doors being open for a lot of other people that bring different skill sets into this. And that was really what my portion was about, trying to predict, well, where do we go from here, and challenging us in order to continue pushing, moving into that direction, focusing more on justice, but being more present in the lives of the community as well. Now, we mentioned being present in the lives of the community. And one of the things about chaplaincy is that most people don't know what a chaplain is until they end up in crisis. So the challenge in our chapter is, how do we then put chaplains in the lives of people so that as they experience a crisis, they already know that the chaplain is the person that they should turn to. Where we used to turn to our pastors before, the pandemic has created obstacles for many churches in actually filling those seats, but also it stressed the systems because pastors can't possibly reach all of the people that needed support. In focusing on the relationship between organizations, which were traditionally within healthcare systems, but focusing on the relationships between organizations and the people outside, chaplains can serve as a bridge so that it's not just coming into the hospital that they're exposed to these people. Now, some of the ways that I've proposed doing this is going to force us to have to actually step into the new millennium a little bit. We have been kind of slow to adapt to the culture, but when we look around us, we have social media, which has really made the world a lot smaller and exposed a lot of people to things. And there are unofficial chaplains who are in social media, but unfortunately, they haven't had the training or the exposure to the value that chaplaincy has. But when we look at the correct avenues to advertise chaplaincy, there are people out there and techniques that we can use in order to really let people know that chaplaincy is available to them. In addition to that, we also look at the community aspect, which I know was brought up before. One of the things that we hope to do is to be able to have chaplains that are in the communities to serve as liaisons, not just between the organizations like hospitals, but actually working with churches who have much stronger relationships with the people that they serve and seeing how we can bridge that gap. In addition to that, we're looking at increasing the diversity of chaplains. Whenever you start removing the barriers to entering the field, we create a strong task force that is able to address the needs of the people much more. And we say, you know, who are the people that are kind of doing this work? Unfortunately, we don't have too many people in the field that have the resources to do stuff. But I look at Sankofa CPE with Danielle McCarroll, where you really look at the justice aspect of care. Pam, you mentioned care and justice as coupling together. And I think Danielle does a great job of not only providing the avenue through the online process, but also the focus on diversifying, focusing on justice, and really uplifting the voices of people that have never had access to this or ever had voice to be represented in the future. So I think that moving forward, one of the challenges that we do have is to make sure that within the educational process, these kind of things are kind of talked about, but also we as educators and practitioners put our students in position to not just make a novelty out of what we're talking about, but to truly integrate into those systems, into people's lives, and change chaplaincy as we know it. Moving forward, I am hopeful that this second edition can incorporate more people's voices as well. I think this is just the start of something. In addition, I do believe that this book is something that is not just going to add value to people who are moving into chaplaincy as a career, but people that just want a good read to understand something, because we have something to share, and it brings a great value to our profession, but also in just letting people know that chaplains themselves aren't just confined to these silos that we speak about, but you probably have a chaplain already in your community that can be used to enhance your life from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you. And folks, we have plenty of time for questions, so you can use the question function down at the bottom of your screen as you wish. Let me just ask, especially Shelly and Pam, you've given us some ideas on how you will use, or how this could be used in the classroom, but how do you see the students that you're working with now being able to take advantage of what a book like this offers?
So I was going to ask to add about teaching the book, because Pam gave a couple of really helpful, a pitch for use in the classroom. And I just want to say last semester, I organized my Intro to Chaplaincy course around the competencies. Now, we didn't have the book available at the time, so but I organized my course around the competencies and use the first and second chapters as a kind of intro to, which is very helpful to have those two chapters to kind of say, this is the history, these are the mandates. But I want to say a couple things, even though we didn't have the individual chapters, just structuring the course around the three big competencies had a couple of effects. So I'll give you an example. I had a student who identifies as a humanist chaplain, but also as a Hindu chaplain. So dual belonging in a very Christian Protestant seminary, right? This is, so it was the most religiously diverse class I've taught since in my 17 years at the School of Theology. This Intro to Chaplaincy course drew people like Rumni to that course. And what was interesting is that she had already come in with an idea that she was going to be a healthcare chaplain, like full on preparing, had a unit of CPE behind her, was heading into more CPE. And on the final day of class, I was asking them to share, things that they learned in the class. And she said, as a result of taking the class, it allowed her to accept a position as a higher ed chaplain, higher ed Hindu chaplain at Wellesley College. So I'm using her as an example that the cross-sector thinking in the course through the competencies, right? It was like these competencies can cross the sectors, is that she's still headed into healthcare, but she'll also have this incredible advantage of being able to have higher ed chaplaincy experience. This is really important because our students are very concerned about getting jobs, and I'm very concerned about them getting jobs. So if there's an ability to teach chaplaincy in a way that allows people to identify competencies across that can cross sectors, this is a real boost for thinking about how we can support our students going into those kind of into chaplaincy as a profession. We know it's not high paying and we know it's expensive. And so for me as an educator, it's an ethical mandate for me to think about how do I prepare people also to kind of cross sectors if they need to be able to do that. The second benefit of teaching the class through the textbook or through knowing that it arose from a big conversation is students reported at the end that they felt like they were part of like a spiritual care revolution. That it felt very forward thinking, it felt very current, and it was reflective of a current conversation, but they actually felt like they were part of something that was not just a kind of chaplaincy of the past, but they felt like they were part of being, of an opening and expansive. I think what Jason is talking about is right, is that many of the students felt like, I have a right to be here, right? I don't know what my tradition is, or I do know what my tradition is, that it was able to create a container for a very vocationally, I will say vocationally exploratory course. What a chaplaincy course was teaching for me was students are doing like 50% vocational exploration. And if students in that course can feel like they can be seen and heard and respected and welcomed into chaplaincy, that to me was like successful course. So I think it offered a kind of current conversation, but I think it will also provide in your settings a way for chaplains who are not in dominant religious traditions to be seen and heard.
Yeah, thanks, Shelly. I think the other thing, a couple of things I want to mention about it. One of the, and this is going off your question a little bit, Michael, but one of the issues that both Dagmar and I were really aware of was the question like, oh, what's a chaplain, or what does spiritual care do, and how that needs to be explained across in all sorts of different contexts, whether in healthcare or prison or whatever, because there are a lot of assumptions. So we were really mindful of that, the text actually serving that purpose too. It's like, we kept saying, would we feel comfortable sharing this with like whoever other colleague, let's say a physician or a nurse or whoever who we're working with in that context, to say this is what it is. So that was something that I think, because we're starting to really build the language and the sort of discourse of this emerging profession, which is coming out into its own in a very distinctive way, right? And so how there are so many misconceptions because of how it used to be, right? Very much specific faith-based chaplaincy, which, you know, located within particular traditions. So in so many ways, I see what's happening in spiritual care and chaplaincy is like this incredible lens for seeing all the changes happening in the sort of spiritual religious world, society as a whole right now. And I think the discipline, as this text really gives it some form in that kind of new ethos, it's really has so much to offer in this context, as well as thinking about the profession of spiritual care. In Canada, especially within healthcare, we just tend to use spiritual care, not so much chaplaincy, except in the military context and prison, I guess, too. But yeah, so I'm very aware of that, because I remember saying once, oh, you know, the field, the academic field of spiritual care and chaplaincy, and someone say, oh, that's not a field, or that's underneath these other categories. And it's like, well, it's really emerging as something, and the sort of multi-religious, spiritually fluid, spiritually integrated, all of that dimension of it brings a whole new context within which chaplaincy is functioning and serving. So it feels like there's a real opportunity here, both for education into the public about what it is that we do and how we do it, and how it is about serving everybody, you know, being grounded within your own practice, or, you know, whatever that may be, but also serving everybody, and what is required for equipping people for that. So this text goes a long way in terms of conceptualizing what that looks like, and that's really exciting to me.
There's a really interesting question in the chat about the audience for this book, and it's specifically about chaplains who are working now and who have some experience. So I think the question is for a recommendation on what are the key elements of the book that folks who have been in the field for a little while, who have experience, can use, because they're not in the classroom anymore, right? They're not going to be learning this in a group setting probably. So for folks who are already out there doing the work, where should they begin? And I don't want to say start on page 1 and just keep going, but where should they begin?
Isn't that a question for you, Jason?
So I say begin on page 1, because I'll say it like this. This book is for everybody, you know, and I think that you can read it and you're not going to feel like you're an outsider. Some may feel like they need to be an academic in order to pick it up and really understand what it is, but it's the kind of book that is going to allow you to actually get into chaplaincy. So you got to start with page 1. But the reality is I think that there's something in there for everyone. So you kind of see where, first of all, where you are, and go to that thing that does interest you, and then allow that to be the thing that opens all the other chapters up. But if you absolutely do not know where to start, just start at the very end with mine, and then you can go back to the beginning.
I think too, what would be interesting for people, those who are in the field for a long time, is to move inside it and see how it connects with your own kind of experience and give certain language to what you're doing, right? That's sometimes we use lots of terms, ministry of presence, some of these other things that float around, right? But trying to really bring those to think about what it is that we're doing and have a language that's there that can be more of a shared language. And I think that's another piece for folks who are out there in the field. And that's where it'd be really fun to have interaction around that. Shelly, do you want to say a bit about the case studies, the online, because they're connected to the text and they're such a great resource, they're online modules that are related to the text, which Shelly's been a part of putting them together, and they're really helpful and they're exercises that students can do or you can do, and it just sort of gives, again, flesh and bones to some of these cases.
Yeah, we did a lot of work as part of this grant, and one of these is the online case studies, which I also used in my classroom. So as assignments, and students, we did name them according to the competencies. So if you want a companion having students read the chapter with an interactive case study, that would be ideal. It also features different authors on them. So you'll see other people who are, active participants in our grant, who were the authors of the case studies. So I think, what we want to underscore there is all this stuff came out of a conversation, an intentional sense that we need more resources. We need to think more diversely about what we're doing. We need to think about the students who are actually coming into our classrooms, for looking for all sorts of things. And I think, so the case studies have been very successful in the classroom. It was really hard to think about how to use different case studies in the book. So it didn't depend on they have to be so interconnected, but they're great for, I would say in CPE sites as well, to use the case studies. Interactive case study, it's like the learner enters and has different options along the way. You can use those as discussions for CPE didactics, etc.
I do want to point out as well, at the end of every chapter, there are a list of reflection questions. And of course, they're sort of obviously set up for classroom use, but there's no reason that everybody can't use those. So, and the reflection questions tie in very closely to the content of that chapter. So it's a way of directly relating that chapter to whatever it is, the work that you're doing. And those questions aren't specific to any given setting. So anyone can really make use of that.
Michael, can I add one plug for the appendix? And I want to give a shout out to my colleague Celine Ibrahim, who helped me. We started to brainstorm a competency checklist for chaplaincy degree programs. So this could be your CPE program, but I was thinking specifically of theological schools. I know the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab gets a lot of questions about, if we were designing our degree program, what do we need to think about? And we, on page 269, after you read Jason's excellent conclusion, is to look at the competency checklist, which would give you a tool for assessing the effectiveness of your chaplaincy program. We organize this according to the competencies. So if you're doing curriculum revision or thinking about changing up your program, that checklist gives you it's not definitive. It just gives you some questions to ask, to think about where in your program you might be addressing different competencies.
Bill's question reminds me, we're using this word competency, and I want to clarify that we're using it in a very broad sense. So not in the sense of an APC defined list of competencies or an ACPE defined list of competencies, but really in a much more conceptual meaning of the term. So Bill, you ask, will reading through this help you in meeting your certification competencies? I think the answer is yes, because familiarizing yourself with these concepts and making yourself an expert in them is going to kind of incidentally filter into those very specific organizational competencies that are set by people like APC, but it's not intended to be a one-to-one correspondence between this book and any given, association or organization. We want this to be accessible to everybody, no matter what the specific benchmarks are that they're supposed to be hitting. So I think the answer is yes, but you will have to kind of apply the lessons learned from the book to those specific certification competencies in a way that is really unique to you. I think we have time for one more question. I want to ask Rob's question here. Jason, this might be a good question for you. So he says, my experience has been that chaplaincy can sometimes be a controversial topic, especially as our culture continues to change in lots of ways. Are there any unique challenges you have faced relating to this? And Jason, I ask you because, of course, I think you're sort of stuck in the middle. You're a humanist serving as a chaplain, and I'm sure people that you serve say, how does that work? And I'm sure there are lots of humanists who say, how can you be a chaplain? So you're right there at the bleeding edge. What's that look like?
Yeah, so, that's a pretty interesting journey that I decided to embark upon. And the short answer is yes, there are going to be all kind of challenges. And I think that is why we need more people that come from diverse backgrounds to kind of enter this space. As far as my own personal experiences with that, there are times where I'll be challenged with people who I'm providing care to that, number one, don't understand what a chaplain is from the first place. Their entire experience is based upon their own pastoral understandings. And number two, from people that are adamantly opposed to chaplaincy because of the histories that the profession has had and the fact that it actually disconnects many people from services that they'd hope to have. However, I have found that, and this goes back to my former CPE supervisor who stated that most chaplains tend to be humanist leaning. There's something built in the humanism, and I speak personally, that actually embodies many of the competencies, the code of ethics and different things that I think chaplains have. So it actually is a natural field for non-traditional people to get into. We just don't know it. And that's why the book is written in a language that makes that clear to folks. And so I say, this is our opportunity to move forward. And if you have questions about that moving forward, I'd love to be a part of that process to help support you in moving that direction. But we know what's coming. And if you feel as if this is a part of your journey, then I think you should do it. And of course, you challenge others and bring them along. The more exposure that we have to professional chaplains, the more defined I think we'll be, but also the more involved in life, in care, and justice we will be for other people. It's been a tough course, but it is absolutely worth it, especially if you come from a non-traditional life stance.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. Thank you, Shelly and Pamela, for your time. This has been so wonderful, and it's almost, it's not almost, it's bittersweet for this to come to an end, because this project has been in the works for such a long time. I mean, how many of us have been involved in things that predated COVID and then persisted all the way through, and now we're bringing them to completion? So that first meeting way back in 2019 feels like a different, universe almost at this point. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you, all of us, our community, for being here with us today. Please do go order the book. You just go to the website, chaplaincyinnovation.org, and you can find it there. The discount code is there. Folks that entered the drawing for the Audible code, I see all those entries, so we'll take care of that over the next couple of days. You'll get those codes in your email. Thank you all for being with us. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, colleagues.